So I'm going to be in conversation with Eric Usher, who's the head of the UNEP Finance Initiative, which is a global partnership with many banks, insurers, and investors around the world, and also with Brune Poirson, former Secretary of State from the Ministry for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition in France, and the Chief Sustainability Officer of Accor. And the problem we're really trying to crack is how we're closing this nature finance gap. The numbers we have from UNEP is that there's a gap of about $4.1 trillion in terms of financing nature-based solutions for climate for 2050, if we're going to meet our targets for climate change, for biodiversity and land degradation. All these things are obviously deeply interlinked. Most of the current investment, however, as we know, is coming from public sources. We simply haven't yet mobilized private capital for this. And so what we're trying to do in the next few minutes in this conversation is really think about how we can mobilize private sources of funding and then really provide that incentives to drive private capital to invest in nature. So I'd like to start with you, Eric, from your perspective at UNEP FI. Really, if you could just give us a sense of what you see as the concrete steps that we need to take urgently to address this nature financing gap. So Eric, maybe I could start with you.
Well, thanks very much, Nick, and a pleasure to be with you and Brune for this discussion. I think to sense of comparison, we have a roughly $4 trillion gap. Globally today, there's measured around $130 billion US that is available to finance nature. Most of this, 86%, comes from public sources. And a very small fraction of this, we think about $14 billion a year, is currently directed towards nature-based solutions to climate change. Although we know that nature-based solutions should ostensibly be able to attract or focus about a third of climate solutions, is a very small amount of resources going in that direction today. So what needs to be done? We would break it down into essentially three key areas. Stealing a page a little bit from the climate book, we would say, and building on from the Paris Agreement, what needs to be embedded within international negotiations, including through the Convention on Biological Diversity and its eventual meeting in Kunming. Three key areas at the highest level: we need to increase global ambition. We need a clear goal for finance to align to, very much inspired by the climate experience. Second, we need voluntary action from the private sector in different forms, and I think maybe we can get to speaking a bit more about that shortly. And third, of course, there is a need for public finance to really strategically sort of incentivize, share risks, and essentially prove out new business models, the type that some of which have not even been imagined yet. There's really a need for innovation. There's a need for the private sector to lean in, and there's a need for long-term direction being plotted internationally between governments and within country policies.
Great, thanks very much for setting the scene. And I think you're really highlighted, I think, the sort of, that's a sense in the climate area, we have over 100 trillion now committed to sort of net zero. And I think on the nature side, we're still really scrabbling to fill this nature gap. Brune, I'm really interested to see if this resonates, Eric's priorities resonate with you. I mean, a clear emphasis he put on voluntary action by the private sector. So it'd be very interesting to hear for a company like Accor, what's the sort of incentives for you to invest in nature and biodiversity, and what have you put together in terms of your strategy and framework around this key priority around nature? Brune, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Nick. Hello again, and it's great to be talking to you this today. Well, to be sort of blunt, the incentive to invest in nature is actually, for a private company, seems obvious, but it's close to impossible to do today. I mean, I'm going to be super blunt, right? Why? Because I think the regulation is not demanding enough. Also, because we don't have the data, and we don't really have sort of the reporting system that allows biodiversity and our impact on nature not only to be calculated, but also to see the impact of the business on nature, but also how we can progress and make sort of nature better or flourish more. And so I think I think these two issues make it close to being to making it very difficult. And I think the third issue is that there is absolutely no awareness, or very little awareness in the sort of business sector of what nature is, what its role is. And I think there's a lot now. I think we've reached a point where everybody knows what carbon neutrality is, but no one or sorry, I don't want to sound arrogant, but few people within the business community are actually aware of the fact that to reach carbon neutrality, you need nature in good shape, and you need nature, otherwise it's impossible to do. And I think we slowly and surely coming to that realization, but it is slow. And so not only we don't have the awareness, we don't have the regulation, and we don't have the tools to measure it. So I sound sort of very gloomy, but I think this is the harsh reality that we're facing today. This is why, as talking from a business perspective, we absolutely need the COP15 for biodiversity to be happening soon. We need it, just like Eric was saying, to be ambitious, and we need then this COP to be turned into the national, domestic, or at least European level, if we talk about European companies, regulation. I think that would be a first step. There is reason to hope, and I don't want to be talking for too long because I know we're going to touch on that. There is reason to hope because I think some investors are pushing for that now, but maybe we can come back to that later.
Brune, thanks very much. I think it's really good to be blunt and direct. I think your trio were really important: the sort of regulatory framework, the data and tools, and then actually I think the strategic awareness. I mean, maybe we can unpack that a bit. I don't know, Eric, particularly on the regulatory side. I mean, policy both in the real economy sectors and so on, but also is there sort of financial regulation and also that we need to do on that? And Brune, I'd really like you to sort of tease out a little bit more that regulatory barrier. Maybe we can then touch on the others. But Eric, any thoughts on these barriers?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of experience that can be drawn from the climate space. We've seen a huge mobilization, including through the GFANZ, a network of alliances, and to Brune's point, we learn a lot, and also nature is much more complicated. But I think the basic tenets of it, of course, we need an enabling environment, and that will combine both improved policies and regulations in the real economy, but also certainly in the financial economy. I think, we have to think back 10, 20 years. We talk now about nature positive and that it's a difficult concept actually, to turn into economic financial models. What are the positive aspects of nature? 10, 20 years ago, we had in the energy sector, the notion of essentially energy positive, there's green energy. And you also had the skeptics then to say, how do you finance the green aspect of it? Nobody wants to pay for it. Today, renewable energy is the biggest part of the energy industry. And it's because of the greenness, it also offers other benefits in terms of energy security and more. And I think nature is the same. There are direct ecosystem-based services that we can get driven from nature. And there are other benefits. And I do believe policy instruments in the enabling environment is key. I think also it's key the relationship between voluntary action from industry to show how things can be done, and for regulators to learn from this voluntary leadership and then realize over time, how do you ratchet that up? So the Paris ratchet applies not only between countries, it also applies between the public and private sector. And we really need to apply that here and now.
Yeah. Brune, you're a former ecological transition in France. Maybe I'd like to sort of give us a bit more detail about where you're talking about those first of those barriers, about the regulation. What are some of the key things we need to sort of fix? And also how private sector can encourage governments to be brave to actually overcome some of these entrenched incentives actually to undermine nature rather to invest in it.
So I think here again, when we talk about nature, it's the same in the public sector actually, or at least in politics. Nature doesn't really. I mean, you would think that it pays off to be supporting it as a politician. Sorry, again, I'm being extremely sort of down to earth, but it doesn't necessarily, because it's a very, very, very local issue. Because it also actually preserving biodiversity is sort of very often, or at least in the country where I was in office in France, sometimes it is seen as really preventing and stopping or curbing innovation, but also, let's say, a lot of the issues that I faced when I was in government was actually a lot of the private sector would come to me and say, look, because of the because of the biodiversity related regulation, I'm not able to build my plant. And
Right.
so on the one hand, the finance minister is asking me to bring jobs to your country, but then on the other hand, because there is, a specific richness of biodiversity in that area, I'm totally unable to do that. So you're constantly faced with that sort of contradiction. It was exactly the same with, energy or climate. So there's still sort of that I would say lack of awareness, first, and second, the corollary or what comes with that is the fact that we don't budget enough for nature. Every year there is a debate in parliament, and every year, you have a few sort of very you have a few people who really believe in that, who are aware of it, members of parliament or even ministers, but it's often not enough to make the balance. And very often, what is also very difficult is as a policymaker, very often you are in the situation where climate and biodiversity are actually not linked, they're antagonistic. And so you constantly have to make choices. Do I go for a wind farm but destroy local nature, or do I go for local nature but prevents the capacity of the area to get a renewable energy? So that sort of constant contradiction is a real issue. So I think awareness is an issue. Lack of budgetary that goes with it is an issue. And third, lack of methodology to actually find a way of making arbitrage or arbitration and actually make a decision where you're faced with very difficult contradictions.
No, I think you're focused on the sort of particularly public budgets, the sort of ministries of finance. When they present their budget every year, they don't have the sort of natural capital accounts alongside it in terms of actually how this is going to sort of invest in the natural ecosystems which are going to provide all those basic inputs we need for our economic health. Eric, you did touch on before this question of sort of, can we go faster on nature because we sort of learn from the climate experience, and particularly by having a specific goal on finance, as we did in the Paris Agreement. We've seen a lot, I think, also in the financial sphere around the role of sort of central banks and regulators in making sure that disclosure is good. Can we read across into this area in terms of biodiversity and nature, the sort of the role for sort of changing the financial system, the rules of the game, which is going to help move capital in the right direction?
I think so. And I mean, if we look at the early drafts of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is being negotiated for completion in Kunming later this year, there already definitely, there's a dedicated call to action to close this financing gap. And it's broken down into, two action areas. One is addressing incentives that are harmful for biodiversity, and the other is for increasing financial resources for international and domestic resources. The goal being to increase funding for all sources to $200 billion US per year, and to increase international flows to the developing countries by at least $10 billion per year. What we're hearing now within the preparatory negotiations, that there's quite considerable debate around this about the way forward. And for instance, interestingly, some African countries have been championing a more, you can say, innovative public-private approach for resource mobilization. I think that it chimes well with a push for alignment of all financial flows rather than just new public funds. Right. So I think really recognizing that public funds will never be enough, and that we really need, for those who know the Paris Agreement, what's called paragraph 2.1c, which said, it's the responsibility of the signatories to align public and private financial flows towards meeting the Paris objective. And so that we need something similar here.
Yeah, no, very, very good. Thanks. Brune, if I could come back to you, the sort of second real barrier you said, which is making sort of nature positive finance really impossible at the moment, was around data and tools. And you're right, we're having some which I think are getting traction on Core and many others like that. Could you give us a flavour of actually what sort of tools you're applying in Accor, sort of how you're managing to get the data, and indeed the signals that you're getting from your investors and shareholders about the value of you having that data in place for them to analyze and interrogate?
Yes. So perhaps building also on your first question. So clearly, the private sector is taking voluntary making voluntary efforts to take into account biodiversity, even when it is not pushed to do that by the regulation. That's what, for example, we've been doing on the ocean. It's really the very beginning, but at Accor, this is what we want to be proactive on that issue. The question is, how do we do that? Because, as you rightly said, Nick, we don't have a reporting system. So we are currently sort of working on building something in-house. I'm not even sure it is going to be super efficient, but the problem is with biodiversity and nature is that it's very, very hyper-local data. It's very difficult to consolidate it, and it requires a lot of input. So that's difficult. So we're currently working sort of on building our own system, but more widely, I think, and I could sense that. I would not say that every investor has, nature in mind, but it's clearly, I could see a change even within, I've been at Accor for about less than a year, a few months, and I could already see and feel a sense of change from the questions that we get from investors. It is increasingly important to them, and I think this is a very, very, for obvious reasons, right? It's a very powerful lever, or a very powerful way of encouraging us to take biodiversity into account. And there is, to be fair, there's also as a European company, we are also we have to anticipate the European taxonomy on biodiversity. So things, as you said, things are getting organized, but it is still a real challenge. But I see hope again, because some investors have become fully aware of it, and they're already beyond climate.
No, really good. Eric, you mentioned earlier, so particularly some of the priorities for Africa, and certainly the work we've been doing with the NGFS and central banks around the world about biodiversity loss. It's very, very clear that emerging economies, developing countries, are most reliant on biodiversity and most at risk for a collapse of ecosystems, but really most in need for finance. So are there particular thoughts, and Brune, it'd be really interesting from your perspective, particular thoughts how we close the finance gap for developing and emerging economies, where really the need is very, very urgent?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if we think of financing within the developing world, it actually shifts less from investors play a role, but banks are the predominant source. Over 90% of financing comes to the banking sector. So the question is, what are they doing to stepping up? And we are seeing a lot of progress. Under the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, we have groups of banks who are working on setting targets. So essentially, what is nature positive portfolios? They've issued their own guidance. We're working with the Biodiversity Pledge to essentially start to really be at a portfolio level, getting the notion of, first, how do we limit harmful actions and financing of businesses that will create damages to nature, biodiversity loss, but then over time, how do we start to get towards this notion of nature positive? And I think, as you've said, economic activities, their reliance on nature type inputs is higher in the developing world. Their ability to be resilient to impacts is often less, and therefore the need for action is ever more critical. I should just point out, disclosure is the first step. Understanding and measuring what you have in your business or your portfolio is a starting point. This task force for nature-related financial disclosures, what's called the TNFD, we're very pleased to see very good progress there. During the course of the year, they will start to put out a framework on what does it mean to really start to communicate, to disclose to investors, to stakeholders, to clients, the impacts of your business in this space. So it's a starting point. But then it's not only about measuring, it's also about acting based on that information. So we have a long road ahead, but at least there's good ambition in the private sector. We're hearing signals from governments. So now the hope is that it will all come together in Kunming and beyond.
Fantastic. No, thanks for mentioning the TNFD, a really crucial part of the architecture that we need. So, Brune, you kicked us off by being very straightforward, very very direct about some of these issues. What are things particularly Accor will be doing, but the steps we need to take in this year of 2022 to make progress on finance for nature?
Well, I think clearly, at the end of the day, it comes with what is necessary. So as Eric was saying, I think disclosure is really the first step, because it's when you disclose that sort of information, it's also sort of internal communications. You're also making it obvious to the rest of your colleagues, for example, in a company, and to the CEO and others. And that's how you sort of build awareness. So I think that's absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is really, investing in nature. Just right. I mean, at the end of the day, it is also a matter of willingness, and it's about making it a priority. It's exactly like climate was a few years ago. At the end of the day, it is really about putting money on the table, but you can't do that alone. And this is where it's another layer of complexity, is that you have to reach out. Sorry, time is off, but I know you have to sort of find a way of working with NGOs, but also the public sector to find innovative ways and innovative sort of sources and solutions for financing and nature.
I think that's a really good way to end. This is a team sport, and obviously there's competition between firms and so on, but actually these needs for partnerships to break through some of these barriers are really important. Well, thanks so much, Brune. Thanks, Eric. This has been really insightful, and hope the audience has really enjoyed this session as much as I have. Many thanks.
Hi, my name is Martin Koehring. I'm the head of Economist Impact's World Ocean Initiative and senior manager in the Sustainability, Climate Change and Natural Resources practice. Sustainability Week is an integral part of Economist Impact's work in the sustainability space. At Economist Impact, we believe that evidence-based insights can open debate, broaden perspectives, and catalyze progress. One of our flagship initiatives is the Sustainability Project, a forum to advance sustainability solutions to accelerate world-changing impact. Our website can be found at impact.economist.com/sustainability. Welcome to this interview on the incentive to invest in nature, which is a continuation of the discussion between Nick, Eric, and Brune that we've just listened to. We'll now be focusing on some of the key questions with Guy Williams, who is Director of Biodiversity and Natural Capital at Deloitte. Welcome, Guy. So just to reiterate, this conversation is about kind of closing the huge gap, the financing gap of $4.1 trillion US dollars for nature-based solutions to climate change. And this gap needs to be closed by 2050 in order to kind of meet global targets on reversing climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. But currently, most investments come from public sources. So the key question is how private sources of funding can be mobilized and also incentivized to invest in nature. So Guy, what are you seeing as the main barriers towards expanded investment in nature, particularly with regard to private sources?
Yeah, well, there's some really fundamental kind of system-wide barriers that we face, and they are around kind of shifting the flow of capital towards from nature negative to nature positive investments. The majority of the investments that we see that have the most lucrative rates of return, that have attractiveness of trade, are things which actually directly lead to a negative impact on biospheres, on ecosystems. So the barrier that we have is to try and fund that. That's at a macro level. At a micro level, what we do see, kind of following on from that, is that this certain type of investment that is actually looking for a relatively immediate reward for the investor. And also the fact that most of the investment that's made on speculative or early phase investments like nature-based solutions is typically the domain of large institutions, impact investors or high net wealth or different types of institutions are waiting for those big institutional investors to kind of take the lead. Those big institutional investors are typically quite risk averse. So there is a barrier where the types of investments at different scale are not packaged and available for different actors within the investment community. So it's very early days, and so those barriers are still to kind of be largely overcome.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. You highlighted, that lots of impact investors, high net worth, individuals are interested in investing, or big investors are expected to take the lead. And obviously, going from nature negative to nature positive is still, seen as a challenge. What are your thoughts in terms of how we can overcome these hurdles as quickly as possible, given the need to kind of accelerate in this space?
Yeah, I mean, what we do, we're talking about the private sector and private finance. And so the types of marketplaces that allow kind of more liquidity and also allow transparency. So different types of investments can come online and be available. really relies upon the private sector and private markets to kind of create those types of trading desks or trading mechanisms. A lot of the work around nature and biodiversity is held by the state, by public authorities, and by held within regulatory schemes and things like that. So we do really need the private sector to kind of activate this new type of natural capital assets. So we are seeing movement in that way, and certainly the carbon market, and obviously what we've seen over the last kind of 5 years in terms of the spike in premium or nature-based kind of climate solutions, kind of really dominating those type of high-value carbon transactions. And we expect to see that kind of broadening out more broadly across a different suite of natural capital asset classes. Carbon and climate is one aspect of nature, and so we can really look and learn from what's happening within the carbon market and the role of the private sector in both activating and triggering that market, and see how that can build out for a broader suite and range of natural capital asset classes. So we're not expecting there to be something kind of a new foundation, a new market for nature. It can really build upon the lessons, and it can also build upon the market trading platforms that we already have available in the voluntary carbon market.
So, Guy, you just mentioned, how important it is to make sure that there's no greenwashing in this space. So, of course, frameworks and standards and regulations are really important. How do you see the role of financial standards, rules, and regulations evolving in this space, including by central banks and supervisors, in kind of driving investment in nature?
Yeah, it's probably central banks who have, one of the biggest responsibilities and also the biggest kind of drives and incentives to be able to standardize the way in which they map, they monitor, and they value nature and natural assets. If we look at those numbers that are often quoted, $44 trillion of economic value, which is flowing into natural assets and is highly dependent upon nature and ecosystem services, the majority of that is flowing through central banks. But if you were to ask many banks, both central, commercial banks, and other institutions, to be able to kind of easily disclose, to visualize where that finance is flowing, they're often coming up with challenges around data, around consistency of reporting and disclosure. And so what we are seeing at the moment is a real drive. In real time, we are seeing a whole suite of new standards and frameworks around how we value, track and trace, and also kind of monetize and communicate the various different impacts and opportunities associated with nature-related impacts. And that's being driven a lot by the commercial sector, and it's been driven by central banks. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is, as we speak, is coming out with its beta framework and is developing that process, is being driven by central banks to be able to make sure that there is consistency in those different ways in which we communicate, assess, and being able to monitor and measure those dependencies upon nature. So they have a clear drive, and that's what we're seeing as the main incentive. And it's a harmonization. It's bringing together a range of existing standards and frameworks to make sure that there is that kind of consistent way in which we communicate these nature-related impacts and also the opportunities associated with new investment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Guy, unfortunately, we have run out of time. It was really fascinating to talk to you. There's lots more to talk about, but you mentioned how important it is to have regulation data in this space to drive consistency, to track and trace. And you mentioned the important task force on nature-related financial disclosure, which is a great way of kind of moving forward in this space and kind of creating a better framework for disclosure. But we've run out of time, so thank you very much, Guy, for all your insights. For further insights, data, and metrics, check out Economist Impact Sustainability Project tab on your platform and online as well. And please stay tuned for the next session of Sustainability Week, which will begin shortly. Thank you very much.